Saturday at 2 o'clock at Cumberland Square Park. We will set up on Lee Street, across the street from where the original Lee Street Baptist Church was located. That church began as a frame church that actually faced Sycamore, which is no longer there. It was called the Anglo-African Baptist Church, which came out of First Baptist Church, which at that time was Goodson Baptist Church, on the corner of Virginia and State Street, or Virginia and then Main Street, where First Baptist Church is now. There were 39 African American people who attended that church, belonged to that church, and either sat in the balcony or in the back of the church, and they wanted their own church. So they moved to that location on Sycamore Street. In, I believe, 1865, which was the end of the Civil War, and only 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Out of that frame church came a man named Charles Henry Johnson, who was pastor of the church for 42 years. During that time, he led the building of the brick church that actually was on the corner of Lee and Sycamore Street. And that location is now a paved parking lot between Bristol, Virginia Courthouse and the Bristol, Virginia Central Fire Hall, and it can be seen there. So these two markers that we're installing will be in Cumberland Square Park, immediately across the street from that site. The church was there until actually Dr. W.A. Johnson came to Bristol in 1961, and he led the efforts to move the church from that location to this location on the corner of Mary and Goodson Street. Now that was quite an accomplishment because a lot of people did not see the need to move the church. But Dr. Johnson will tell you that because of the location of Beaver Creek on the other side of the fire hall and the flooding of Beaver Creek on too many occasions, the church began to fall into ill repair structurally because of the water damage that they incurred from time to time.
Well, it's a historic church, and one of the oldest black churches in Virginia. And in fact, it's the oldest black church in Bristol, and the first one that came here first. So it's an old historic church, known all over the state because the guys who were here had doctorate degrees. I don't know how they got men with doctorate degrees because, we didn't even have universities. we didn't even have schools. They always had well-educated men here. And so they got Dr. Johnson, C.H. Johnson, and he had been to Virginia Union, and we were just getting started with seminaries and schools, and they got him here. He came here, and so he got it organized and built the church downtown. Very strong church, and I don't know how many members they had, but the church would seat close to 1,000 people, and a lot bigger than this church. And he brought them in, and he had a powerful church here. And it was one of the leading churches in the state and one of the leading churches in the nation, and that was C.H. Johnson. And it was his sons, the ones that you see in the paper now, they were the guys who just sort of were well-educated. He sent his kids off to school and so forth. So they had leaders who were educated and trained pastors here. Seminary graduated, which we didn't have seminaries. We were just getting started. But somehow Lee Street, they wanted the best, they wanted that we have in the denomination, and so they would go to the school and get the pastors. And that's how they got me. When the church became vacant and they didn't have a pastor, they had a pastor from Tennessee, and he didn't stay long. He was adopted to Tennessee. He was in Tennessee. His father, and he was related there, and affiliated there. So he wanted to get back into Tennessee, because he was known. And so he stayed here about 3 years, and once the door got open, he went back in because that was his state. And so then they decided to leave Tennessee alone and go back to Virginia and get somebody that from their state that they were affiliated with would stick with Virginia. And so I was graduated from school at that time, and I was one of the pastors, not the only one, but I was one of the pastors that came here from the school. They were determined to get somebody from Virginia who knew the church and knew the affiliations, and so I was one of them. And they selected me. They wanted me to come be the pastor. And it was fine with me, but now I wasn't sure that this was as far as I wanted to go. You know, I had bigger thoughts and bigger ideas, and I accepted this as a stop along the way, because I'm going to do bigger things in bigger cities, and you know, that was my thinking. And not knowing that I was going to do that here, because it wasn't a big promise here, wasn't much going on here. And the old church downtown was weak and sitting on the banks there of the Beaver Creek, and just scary, because time had taken its toll, and the foundation was cracking and all. And then they didn't see that. They didn't know that they had the biggest church around. I saw it, and I knew it, and I knew that something has to be done, or the creek will eventually take a route. So I came, and I knew that it had to go. It had to get out of that building. Well, now they were adapted to that building. This was big, old, bigger than this building, and famous and known throughout the state. And they thought it was top of the line. And it was, but the building was not sound, not safe. It was too close to the old Beaver Creek and flooded. And the Lord wanted me to move it, give him a church.
Charles Spurgeon Johnson was born at 711 Moore Street, which was this side of VI College, toward town from VI College. All those properties, all those houses in that section are gone now. But we do know he was born there. He grew up here. He and his mother went downtown to a soda fountain one day, and they were refused service. Charles Spurgeon Johnson said that was his first recollection of the color of his skin being different, and that it was hard for him to comprehend that they could not get a soda or whatever they wanted at that place of business, for which they were willing to pay simply because of the color of their skin. Charles Spurgeon Johnson could not get the education he sought in Bristol because the schools were not available, so he went elsewhere in Virginia and was very well educated. He became a very socially dynamic. Charles Spurgeon Johnson became very much involved in race relations, race riots, education. He was a scholar, a teacher, a mover and a shaker. And to make a long story short, he was the first African-American president of Nashville's Fisk University. I don't know if he ever would have been recognized to this extent if had it not been for an article in the Bristol Herald-Courier, something to the effect that the most famous man you've never heard of. And the Herald-Courier brought to our attention how important Charles Henry Johnson and his son Charles Spurgeon Johnson were to Bristol. Tina McDaniel and Margaret Feierabend and I were involved in the first committee meetings working toward having a Martin Luther King celebration day in Bristol. It hadn't been done. And during those committee meetings, we recognized the article in the newspaper that talked about these men and about the history of Lee Street Baptist Church. At some point shortly thereafter, I made a motion before the board of the Bristol Historical Association that we allocate $2,000 toward putting a marker recognizing these men in this church somewhere in downtown Bristol. When we began to think about the wording of a marker, and we were thinking of one marker, we felt that Charles Henry Johnson and Charles Spurgeon Johnson in the history of Lee Street Baptist Church were all very important. And we worded a marker draft that included all three of those. The Virginia Department of Historic Resources replied by saying, "We think you need 2 markers." We started making some inquiries through the Johnson family and friends of the Martin Luther King Committee and the church, Lee Street Baptist Church, and we raised the money for 2 markers so that both the men and the church could be recognized in the manner in which they deserve to be recognized. So that's why we are setting, recognizing, and dedicating 2 markers Saturday. These will be the first 2 that have recognized the accomplishments of African American people in a church in any form or fashion. So it's timely that we recognize that African Americans in Bristol have been important, not just to Bristol, which they have been, but to the nation. And that the descendants of these men have gone on to great things. And we need to latch on to that, make it known in Bristol and throughout the region and the nation, which we're doing Saturday. Jay Johnson is the great-grandson of Charles Henry Johnson and the grandson of Charles Spurgeon Johnson. Jay Johnson was the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security under President Obama. Someone involved in our committee knew of him and his relationship with these 2 men and reached out to him to see if he was interested in what we were doing. He was very interested and has shared a lot of his thoughts, a lot of his information, historical documents, etc., that have allowed us to build on the history. And he will be here Saturday, acknowledging these men, recognizing his family, some of whom will be here, and he will speak.
I really feel like for a community to be inclusive, the narrative of everyone that's in that community should be represented. And I was semi-retired, so I spent some time just kind of searching to find out about the history of the Black community in Bristol, and there was very little to none in terms of information that was out there. So I went around and started visiting with some of the older folks in the community, spent a lot of time with Dr. Johnson here at Lee Street, just asking questions about the history. So whenever the article came out in the paper in December 2017, it was like, this is like music to my ears, because I believe that for our youth, you can't be what you can't see. And whenever you think about the history here, there are people within the Black community, within the African American community, who have made a contribution, and their contribution is really what makes the community history so rich. And that information just was not available. So December 2017 was a really exciting time for me. I think I read that article multiple times, did research, bought books that Charles Spurgeon Johnson had published, and read about him. So it just really sparked a huge interest in me, and I really feel like it's important for our youth to say, or to see that, you know what, greatness, came from this community, and that means that I can also attain that.